Roughly a year ago, I got a cold phone call from somebody I'd never heard of, a gentleman up in Prescott by the name of Mike Rothmiller. He kind of introduced himself and said, "Hey man, I've got a story for you. It's crazy, but it's fascinating." He launched into this thing about the former police chief in Mexico City and an assassination plot against the president of Mexico, and it kind of all jumbled together. And I was looking online while he was talking to me, trying to see if there was substance to what he was saying or if it was crazy, and it seemed to have substance. So I said, "Man, why don't we sit down and talk about this?" So I drove up and we met halfway between Prescott and Phoenix and had a Mexican lunch together, and he started telling me the story. The first step for any journalist is to try to figure out whether your source is telling you the truth. And part of that figuring out process is backgrounding your source. So I started researching Rothmiller, found all kinds of stuff. This guy was a feature story in himself. So he had this crazy background himself, and that kind of eased me a little bit too about this guy is not a BSer, he's got something to tell. And then once you have that meeting with somebody and they start giving you facts, you go out and you try to double check them. And you do it by looking at public records, you look at old newspaper articles, and you confirm it with other sources. In this case, we're talking about a yarn, and I mean a convoluted yarn that goes back 35 years or so. And so it took a lot of research and a lot of digging. Part of the story that Rothmiller was telling me was that, to put it in simple terms, he had met this police chief way back in the early 1980s because he was working security on the LA Olympics that were upcoming and needed to do an exchange of intelligence for possible terrorism. And he went down to Mexico City and he was introduced to the police chief. And over the years, he had real misgivings about this chief, and in fact, he turned out to be right. The chief was a very corrupt individual, probably the most corrupt lawman in Mexico's history. And so Rothmiller always paid attention to him through the years and was always trying to figure things out. And a few years ago, he put in public records requests with the federal government, with the FBI, the Secret Service, State Department, all kinds of agencies, to find out everything they had on this police chief that he had gotten to know 35 years ago or so. The key to what Rothmiller found was a CD that had finally arrived at his house from the FBI, containing hundreds of pages of documents. And these documents had never before been seen. And they outlined a dramatic and long-range manhunt and an unbelievable conspiracy allegation involving this former police chief and a plot to assassinate the president of Mexico. And his ability to get these records and the fact that we have a law that makes them public, it kind of demonstrates just how vital public information laws are in the United States. In this case, it's basically rewriting history. It's a historical event that's pretty darn significant that had never been exposed before. But on a day-to-day basis in every newsroom, reporters are putting in public records requests and getting information on the breaking news, what's happening in the White House, what's happening in Congress, what's happening in the courts. And so, yeah, I think this demonstrates just how important that right to public records is. Whenever we tackle a story, we don't even know if it's going to evolve into something that runs in the newspaper or online. We start out by thinking maybe there's a story here, and we start digging, and we determine step by step whether we have enough to tell the story and whether the facts are correctly verified to do so. But this story was clinging to me the whole time. It's in the back of my head because it's just so fascinating. And part of me is thinking, well, this is really history more than news, and it's going to be a long yarn. I hope people will read it. And part of me is thinking, I got to tell this story because it's just too cool.